Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here with us this evening. We're really excited that you were able to make the time to come. So my name is Shayna Cummings, and I'm one of the directors for Women Who Code in Boston. Tonight, we're really excited to be joining up with our friends from Boston Python and for this collaborative event. So just a few housekeeping items. This event is being recorded and the talks may be posted. So if you want to stay anonymous, just keep your camera off. Please use the chat window to submit your questions during the event. And then we're going to have time for socializing at the end of the event. So we'll do some Zoom breakouts if you'd like to meet and mingle with some of the other participants. So we're going to just go really quickly a little bit through about our organizations and our code of conduct, and then we'll get started with the talk. So for those of you who have never been to a Women Who Code event before, welcome. We're really happy to have you. We are an international nonprofit with networks across the entire world. I think there's like 70 or something cities. Our mission is to inspire women to excel in their technology careers. But we're not just women and we're not just coders. So we welcome everyone at our event. Anyone who's interested in helping create a better community in tech is welcome. Our vision is a world where women are represented as technical executives, founders, VCs, board members, and software engineers. A few other pieces about our network. We have about 6,500 members in our meetup. We run 2 to 4 free events per month. We're doing all of our events online through at least mid-2021, probably through the end of 2021 realistically. And we have a variety of different formats. So we have tech talks like these. We also have some study groups. We also have panels. We're going to be doing a workshop with the Vue Vixens meetup actually next week if you're interested in doing some front-end work. And we also have events for networking and community. So suggestions are always welcome. If you'd ever like to give a talk for us, please be in touch and we would love to have you. You can also check out more about our organization on womenwhocode.com. We have a code of conduct that we take really seriously. So we are an inclusive community and we're dedicated to providing an empowering experience for everyone who participates in or supports our community, regardless of their gender, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, race, and all of these other factors, including preferred programming language. You know, anyone who is here to inspire women to excel in technology careers is totally welcome. We don't tolerate harassment in any form, and we do have a full copy of the Code of Conduct available on our website. You can also, if you experience any harassment tonight, please message me, and we also have a form for reporting that. Without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ned from Boston Python.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ned Batchelder. I'm one of the organizers of Boston Python, which is a meetup group that's been operating in the Boston area for 10, 15 years, something like that. We have a little over 10,000 members. We used to do 2 events each month. We've been trying to get back to that cadence. We aren't quite there yet. We are interested in different kinds of events and in learning what works well virtually. So I'm really excited to continue talking to Shayna about study groups, for instance, how those work. One of the great things about virtual is it's really easy to dip into something. You don't have to drive anywhere. You don't have to find a place. We can't offer you food, but on the flip side, we don't have to figure out how to pay for food to give you food. So we can maybe get smaller events happening more frequently rather than 100-person events twice a month. So I'm really interested in figuring out how to make that happen. What's on the screen right now is our informational website, about.bostonpython.com. There's a link there to our Slack workspace where everyone is welcome. You can get job postings there. You can get questions answered there. We have an organizing channel there where we can talk about how the group is run. If you have an idea for an event that you'd like to run, you can get in touch with us there. We also have a code of conduct. I did not do a line-by-line analysis to see how the 2 groups' codes line up. I'm assuming that we're all in the same spirit. And if you need any help, you can also reach out to me as an organizer. John Kaparsky is also here as one of the Boston Python organizers. And I didn't notice, but it might also be that Brian Rutledge is here. Brian R, I believe, is one of our organizers in the participants list. So that's Boston Python. We are also sort of, we welcome everyone. We can't be quite as language agnostic as Women Who Code is. But for instance, in years past, we did actually run an event that was all about other languages you might need to use with Python, where we covered SQL and CSS and HTML, which was an interesting night. It had no Python in it, but it was of interest to Python people. So we're very interested in helping people upskill with Python. Python is very hot right now because of data science, as you'll see from the second of our talks. So we're very interested in welcoming new people into the Python community and helping you get started, which is one of the inspirations for the two talks that we have tonight.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ned. And thank you again to all of you for being here and to our wonderful speakers. So my screen seems to be frozen. But without any further ado, Ned, if you'd like to introduce our first speaker for the evening.
Sure. So let me, before I introduce the first speaker, let me just say a little bit about the talk. So the meetup event page is listed 3 talks. Unfortunately, we're only going to be able to have 2 of them tonight. So tonight we have Lael speaking about JavaScript to Python, which is basically you learned JavaScript, now you want to know Python. What's sort of the delta? How can you bridge that gap and quickly get into Python, leveraging what you know from JavaScript without getting confused about the things that are different between the two? And Katie is going to talk to us about data visualization with Python, which gets into more of the data science side of things. We had a talk listed for, I have a CSV and what can I do with it, which unfortunately we don't have for you tonight. But that means that we'll have more time for questions and answers and socializing afterwards. So the way we'll run the talks is I'm about to hand the screen over to Lael. If you have a question during the talk, you can put it into the chat. And I'll be monitoring the chat. And some of the questions will naturally be things that we can discuss once the talk is over. And some will be ones that we should interrupt the flow to get a clarifying answer to. And I'll take care of choosing between those 2 things and interrupting the speaker. So unless we're completely overwhelmed with questions, we'll be able to get to all of them. So just feel free to type them in the chat. Okay, so as I mentioned, our first speaker is Lael Birch. Lael and I are in the interesting position of being coworkers at a company, but Lael joined since the lockdown, so Lael and I have never met and have barely spoken. But I was able to reach out on our internal Slack looking for speakers, and Lael graciously stepped up to the plate to talk about JavaScript to Python. Lael, are you ready to take it over?
Yeah.
Sarah asked in the chat, what company? Lael and I work at edX, which is the nonprofit founded by Harvard and MIT to put college courses online to educate the world. Yay. It's all open source, by the way.
Yeah.
All right, I'll shut up now and Lael can speak.
So my name is Lael Birch. As Ned said, I work at edX as a software engineer. I use both JavaScript and Python every day. And so this is going to be an introductory kind of talk about switching from JavaScript to Python. So we're going to talk about some of the differences between JS and Python and why they matter. Some little things about how to think like a Python developer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to debug your Python code, and then we'll do questions. I do want to stress this does not nearly cover all of the differences between JS and Python. It's skimming the surface, but I'm gonna do what I can here. So there's some basic things to consider when you're switching from JavaScript to Python. One of the first things you'll notice is people are doing snake case and not camel case. You'll want to do that. And one of the reasons is, so I was looking at some code the other day, and I was using a library, and I was digging into it to see exactly what was happening, to see if I could figure out what I was doing wrong or what needed to happen. And I saw they were using camel case, and I was like, okay, this library was written by someone who doesn't write in Python on a regular basis. So especially if you're applying for jobs, you're going to want to have snake case for your variables and initial caps on your class names. Whatever you do, don't put a dash in your Python variables. That won't work at all, or in your packager file names. It makes them really, really hard to import. The other thing that you'll notice immediately about Python is that white space is important. One of the common gotchas when you're first starting is that you'll mix tabs and spaces. The Python interpreter really doesn't like that. So you'll want to set your editor to insert spaces instead of tabs when you hit tab. All text editors can do this. One of the things we're going to talk about is that there's a lot more built-in data types in Python, and truthiness and falsiness is different. So, data types. JavaScript doesn't have a whole lot of data types. It has more than it used to. But these are the basic data types in JavaScript. In Python, we've got a lot more, right? Instead of just number, we've got 3 different numeric types: int, float, and complex. Instead of just objects, we have sequences like lists, tuples, and ranges, sets, frozen sets. We do have strings. We have binary sequence types like bytes, bytes arrays, and memory view, dicts. And then there's modules, classes, none, and Boolean types. So what? Why does this matter? One of the differences is that different data types are going to have different performance characteristics. So it's not something that you'll need to think about right away when you're switching to Python, but it is something you want to keep in mind. You may want to choose a tuple over a list for performance reasons. You might want to resist the urge to use a dict or a list when you should be using a set, right? There's different considerations when you want to choose your data types in Python versus JavaScript. Sorry, I've talked about this a little. Tuples are immutable in Python, and they're faster for large data sets. And I want to show you one of the gotchas with tuples. So this is a tuple with a comma. This is not a tuple, right? So if I run this code, right, the first one is a tuple. The second one is a string. I've been caught a dozen times with that. Remember the comma. So numbers, JavaScript numbers are always represented by floating point notation. Because Python separates these and has ints and floats, there's fewer number quirks. JS, especially when you get into very large numbers, can be a little weird. Python has less of that. And one of the things you'll have to think about when you're moving to Python is that, yes, there's going to be some implicit changes. So if you add an int and a float, it will become a float. But you'll have to remember that that's now a different type. And there's also byte string versus string. Python forces you to be a little more careful about encoding when you're doing I/O or when you're using files a lot, you'll have to deal with byte strings more often, which are different than strings. They're a series of bytes and they're not necessarily human readable. And there's less implicit typecasting. So if we come over to the Python interpreter and I say 7, which would give me a string 7 foo in JavaScript, I'm going to get a type error in Python. So we have to convert to a string in order to get the same result as we would in JavaScript. This is actually a feature that I like about Python. I'm less likely to get things confused, I think. So the next thing that I want to talk about is what's false in JavaScript versus Python. In JavaScript, the number 0 is false. The big int 0n is false. Keyword null, undefined, Boolean false, nan, and the empty string. Nan is not a thing in Python. It'll just throw an error if you try to do something that would be nan in JavaScript. In Python, a lot more things are falsy. None, false. All of the number types, right? So there's these. This is the int. This is the float. This is the complex number. The thing that I really like is that empty lists and empty dicts are also false. Obviously, empty strings, empty sets, empty ranges. And then objects can have this underscore bool defined on them, which returns false, or if their length returns 0, they're false. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So if I have a class that is an album, right? It's going to have songs. When I initialize it, it's going to have an array of songs. And I've defined on it these properties, len and bool, with these underscores. And so I'm just returning for an album, I think the length should be the length of the number of songs on it. And I think that it should be truthy if it has more than one song on it. And that's something that I, as the developer, have decided, right? And so, so if I run this code, I'm still in the Python interpreter, so I'm just going to import it. Oh, I'm doing it backwards. Another thing is that your imports are backwards, and if you switch between JavaScript and Python all the time, like I do, you're going to get it wrong constantly. What did I do? Sorry, always, the more people that are watching you code, the more mistakes you make. So if I create an empty album, and another album with songs, oops, I want that to be a list, otherwise we'll be sad. Then I can use this, I made a little function that prints it if it's true. So if I do you can see what this is doing. Oops. File. I don't know how that got here. Oh, I must have. So I gotta get out of here and.
Spy elf sounds kind of cool anyway. But...
File. Yeah, I put in the PY. The PY got in there somehow. Exciting. So here's my one element song, and here's my empty album, and here we will print if true. Oh, I didn't import it. There we go. That album is falsy, and this album is truthy. So I really like this feature. It's, you know, it's a cool way to define whether an object is, how an object is truthy or falsy.
By the way, I'll just point out, Lael, if you could go back to the other screen.
Yeah.
On line 18 on the if statement, you've still got parens around your condition, which JavaScript requires, but Python does not. It doesn't hurt in Python, but you can.
That's so true.
You can leave out that punctuation in Python if you like.
Yes, you can tell. Like today, I was using JavaScript more.
It is tricky to switch back and forth.
It has its and there's a bunch of things that work in Python. Like you can put a semicolon at the end of the line, but you shouldn't.
And while we're here, line 19 and 21 also have parens on print. Print is a statement that doesn't need parens. It's not a function.
You do need, don't you need parens now in Python 3?
No, in Python 2 you needed them. In Python 3 you no longer do, but it's just a parenthesized string, so it still works.
Yeah.
Right.
So why do we care about truthy and falsiness? When you're making the switch, it means there's things that are truthy in J.
I'm sorry. I'm being corrected in chat. I had it backwards. You were right.
You did.
I was wrong. I'm getting flustered. I'll shut up now.
No worries. One thing you will find out when you switch to Python is that there's a lot of things that were different about Python 2 and Python 3. Mostly, if you're switching now, you shouldn't have to worry about it unless you're using real legacy code. But there's a lot of gotchas there. So truthy and falsiness. Some things that are truthy in JS will be falsy in Python. So that's a thing to keep in mind. As I said, with lists and stuff, I find this to be a lot nicer, right? Because if you do if array.length is greater than 0, do something, like you just have to do if. And please don't go to sleep automatically. So there's no need, and there's no need for jumping through hoops to check if a dict is empty, right? I don't need Lodash to know if something's empty. I can just say if my dict, call it a day. And defining these object.bool and object.length is going to help you define classes that have these built-in truth values, like our album. Cool. So this brings us to thinking in classes. The first thing that I want to say here is I feel it is worth your while to learn the difference between prototypal and class-based inheritance for interviews, if nothing else. But no, I think it's worth your while. JavaScript has prototypal inheritance. It does have that class syntax, but that is syntactic sugar on prototypal inheritance, and Python uses class-based inheritance. And it would take me the full 20 minutes to talk about the difference between those. So I'm going to leave you with some links. and as an exercise for the class. The other thing to think about classes is the method resolution order. When a class inherits from multiple other classes, the child class is going to search first for the attribute in its own class if it has it, and then if it's not found, it'll search in its parent classes in depth first, right, left, right order, sort of. And that sort of is kind of, when I was coming up with examples for this, I ran into that sort of. And so one of the ways you can know your method resolution order is by taking the instance of your class, doing .mro. It'll show you the method resolution order, so that if you're confused with multiple inheritance about where it's going to look for the method, you can just look at it and find it out. So let me give you so if you have this class, grandparent A, it has eye color gray, grandparent B has an eye color brown, parent A just inherits from grandparent A, parent B inherits from grandparent B but has a different eye color. And then you have two children and they have a different order of the parents. And that's going to cause them to resolve this differently, right? So if I run this, it's right. So my child A's eye color is going to be gray because it goes to parent A. Parent A doesn't have eye color defined, so it goes to grandparent A and gets this gray eye color. And parent B, child B, has blue eye color because it went to parent B first and just got it, and eye color was defined. And I do really like this MRO method if you're in doubt, and I clicked on it, so you get everything. The next thing I want to talk about thinking in classes is private methods, and you'll see that this is in quotes. Private methods are by convention in Python. It's not enforced by the language. So we're talking about, I have this example for private methods. It's an album again, and it has a player for it. And so it has this, you can play a song with it, and it goes and gets the player and then plays the song, which allows me to have this implementation where if the player hasn't been defined on my instance, then I go get an iPhone and play it on that, right? And so the underscore in front of this get player method indicates that it's a private method. And I could replace it with a completely different implementation, and this play method would still work. And people who are using this class, developers who are using this class, don't have to know how that method works. So this allows some encapsulation, and the consumer, if you see a method with an underscore in front of it in Python, you shouldn't be using it directly. Can you? Yes.
And Python has a slogan of "We're all adults here," meaning I'm not gonna prevent you from doing something. You're the author of your program. I will give you a signal to tell you maybe you don't want that thing, but you're an adult.
You get to do it. You get to abuse it as you wish. The other thing that about thinking in classes that is not a thing that is we really see in JavaScript is decorators. I'm just going to show you the most common decorator. This is another album class because that's what all my examples are today. So I wanted an album class that would show all the albums that I've created with it. So I have a class variable that stores all my albums. When an album is added, So this init method is called when I initialize an album, and it adds the album to the list of all albums, right? And I have this method with a decorator. This is the decorator. It's the class method decorator. And that makes this method available to the class album, but not to instances of the class. So let me show you this real quick. No. So if I make because it's taking a name here. If you haven't listened to either of these albums, they're completely worth your time. And then, so if I do album1.all, it's not defined. My instances of the class don't have access to this. But if I do,
you typed album.all.
oops.
Album1.all will actually work.
Oh yeah, okay. And you can also do it with the class.
Can I make one tweak?
Yeah.
So you in your class method, you named your first parameter self, but it's much more common to
have it be class.
Right,
Yeah.
CLS, right, short for class.
So true.
Class is a keyword. And that emphasizes the fact that that method will have the class passed into it as the first parameter rather than the instance passed into it. Even if you call it on an instance, it gets passed in the class.
And so decorators, like this is a fancy syntax, but it's basically a closure over this method. And you'll see decorators used in a lot of different ways. Great. Before I go on, are there any questions about this kind of stuff? Classes, truthiness, false.
Lael, either you are completely nailing it, or everyone is a total genius, or they're too shy to ask questions. I'm not sure which of the three.
I mean, it's some people already know Python, so it's not news to them.
Some people like me chime in and say the wrong thing about Python 2 and Python 3, so maybe we should be asking more questions.
So one of the things I like a lot about Python is I don't use array methods as much. So some common methods that we use for JavaScript arrays like .map or length are standalone functions in Python. And I've got a link here to you'll want to look at these standalone methods in Python because they're gonna be useful for your Python career. Other methods are similar to JavaScript array methods like append instead of push. The true joy for me with working with Python arrays is list comprehensions. I really love them. I don't know why. But I'm going to show you a couple. So this is, let me do map first. This is map in JS. If I have a list of prices and I want to get the prices after tax, I do prices.map and have a little anonymous function. In Python, and I'm going to put this in a so
Might be easier if you split them horizontally because they're wide.
Oh, that's true. I'll do that on the next one. Oh, because we got too big.
Yeah, that's my fault.
Try again. Split down. I so rarely have things that are small enough that I want to split them horizontally. So here we have the same thing with a list comprehension. And so this kind of looks like you're defining an array, and you kind of are. But basically you have this. This is what you're going to do, and this is your iterable. It can be a list. It can be any iterable. And for each thing in the list, you know, so this is a variable. It could be X, right? And that's how you do most mapping things in Python. I don't think I've ever used the Python map method. And it's very similar for filter. So I have filtering in Python. In JavaScript, same deal. You're going to use this filter method on the array and, you know, return the price if the price is greater than 5. And you'll see in Python, it's a little bit different, but it's the same kind of syntax we saw in the map example, but you've got an if statement here. So we only give it back if the price is greater than 5. And you can also do fancy things like FizzBuzz, which I think is hilarious to do with the list comprehension. Like, this isn't super readable, but it's pretty fun. So you can do it.
Boston Python does not endorse every code sample in this presentation.
Yeah, no, I don't endorse it either. Never write this. It's just fun. And oh, a quick word about nested list comprehensions. In my opinion, no, don't. When they get nested, they get very hard to read. If you have to, one level, but 2 levels of nested list comprehensions, just so you know. So some more things about thinking in Python. In JavaScript, when I want to do something, I often am, you know, looking on npm for a module that does it. In Python, the standard library is pretty large, and you should probably look there before you start looking for a library on PyPy. So I put an example here of the math library. It does so much, especially for math and science type functionality. The standard library is really good. Human readability is favored. You want to use the word or, the word and instead of the pipes. Try-catch blocks are a lot more common. I see them more in newer React code, but they're a lot more common in Python. And a common early error is catching any exception in your catch block. You really only want to catch the exceptions that you expect to see, and you want the other exceptions to actually raise the errors that they would raise. Python debugging. The Python interpreter is your friend. And if you're in Django, the Django interpreter is super your friend. So good. So you've already seen some examples of that tonight, right? When I wanted to look at what happens if I add 7 and foo, I just go into the Python interpreter, type it in, see what happens, play around, see what works. Super great. There's also the Python debugger, and above Python 3.7, the standalone function breakpoint. It's just a syntactic difference, but it does the same thing as import PDB. And this is also a really great way to get into your code and see what's going on there. So just a very quick example of that. I have this debugging. Go away, go away. So I have this thing that has my album has a track order, and I want to set the song order. This doesn't, and it's not working. And so one of the things I can do to debug and play around and see what's in there is put in this statement, import pdb, pdb.setTrace. And so when I run this code, so it is, debugging. And something went wrong, of course. I swear I did this right before.
Live demos.
Live demos, what can you do?
They don't work better in Python than they do in JavaScript.
So true. But anyway, what this does is it sticks you into a Python interpreter that is in the code here. You can go to the next line. You can type stuff in and see what your variables look like, try things. And I really like it. I use it a lot for figuring out what's going on. So my last slide, I think it's my last real slide, it is about tools you might want when you're switching to Python. PyEnv is a great tool that helps you manage your Python versions and when you're switching between projects. As a Python developer, I switch between Python versions all the time. PyEnv makes it really easy. The other thing you want to get familiar with is virtual envs. NPM kind of handles this for you in JavaScript. In Python, you're going to use either the Python 3 tools to create a virtual env, so that keeps your packages for whatever app you're working on separate from your globally installed Python packages or whatnot. Or you can use a tool like virtual env wrapper that puts a nice wrapper on it, gives you a lot of commands for handling your virtual environments. I use that a lot less now that Python 3 has the tools to do it. You're also going to want to get a good linter. Flake 8 and PyLint are the most commonly used ones that I've seen. As you are going through and linting, you will want to familiarize yourself gradually with PEP 8 guidelines. So PEP 8 guidelines are the guidelines for writing Python code. The way I would recommend familiarizing yourself is when your linter has an error, go look up that error, go search PEP 8 for that. If you try and absorb all of PEP 8 at once, you will fall asleep, and it's too much. But I do think it's helpful to look at the PEP 8 guidelines and see what people were thinking about when they made that linting rule. The other thing you're going to want is to get familiar with some testing tools. I think unit test and PyTest are definitely the most commonly used ones. PyTest can run unit test tests, but not vice versa. Unit test is built in, and there's also mocking that is now built into the standard library in Python 3. And these are really useful tools for testing. And if you're going to be, learning Python and looking for jobs in Python, you definitely want to get familiar with some Python testing tools. So the code examples, most of which work, and I'll push some small changes to them, are here. And does anyone have any questions about making a switch? And they can be questions about, like, this was kind of technical, but you can also ask me questions about job-wise, how it was to make that switch and whatnot.
So first of all, Lael, thank you very much. This was great. I would not have wanted to take on sort of capturing all of that at once. And I know
I didn't even get into like lambdas.
no, I know
that
you can't cover everything. And honestly, when you got to that map in JavaScript, I was mostly squinting at it, thinking, "How does that work in JavaScript? I don't get it." Okay, that's off the point. We had some questions in chat, and we had little answers along the way. But so one thing I'll point out, if you weren't following the chat, we are going to be posting the slides. I'm going to be asking Lael to post the slides to the Meetup event page as a comment. So there'll be a link there. Afterwards, you can get them. Let's see. So Mike points out that in JavaScript, for x in array loops over the indexes of the array, 0, 1, 2, 3. Whereas the exact same thing in Python for x in array loops over the values from the array, which is probably actually a list, not an array.
Yes. Yes. And that is great for me.
Yeah. Lael, I almost interrupted you with this one. When you were looking at the list comprehensions, there was a question about the naming and using price and prices in the list comprehension. It's a tricky balance because price and prices are sort of naturally the singular and plural that makes sense there, but they're also so visually similar that they could be confusing. So what advice have you got for people?
Yeah, I think it's like it is the common thing to kind of do that, but like I feel like if it gets confusing, like and people often do just use X or I for these. I personally like writing out a full variable name, and yeah, as you say, it's kind of hard to think of a better one. You could maybe abbreviate it, right? Do something like PR, and then it's clearer that it's different.
Right, you've still got some mnemonic value, but it's not visually confusing.
But it's also when you get used to reading the list comprehensions, like I feel like it doesn't bother me as much because I know that this prices is coming after the in. I know it's a different thing. I know it's the iterable.
We had some discussion in the chat also about arrays versus lists. I pointed out that what the thing in JavaScript called array and the thing in Python called list are exactly the same kinds of thing.
Yes.
And confusingly, Python also has a built-in module in the standard library called array that literally no one ever uses. Ever.
No. Is the one in the standard library, is it like it has to have a set length? Or
it has to all be the same data type, so it has to be homogeneous.
Which maybe people should use it more, but they don't.
we can debate the value of having non-homogeneous lists, but the fact is it just doesn't get used. If you see the word array in a Python program, it's either someone talking about a list, or they're using a NumPy array, which I imagine Katie is going to be showing us some of in the data visualization talk. But it is a confusing thing because we use very different terms for what is essentially exactly the same thing. And by the way, a Python list is not a linked list. So if you came from a CS background and you learned about linked lists, you might assume that Python lists are linked lists. They are not. They are just like arrays in JavaScript.
Yeah, except they're not objects.
They are objects.
Well,
but they are not like JavaScript objects.
They're not like JavaScript objects. Yeah.
Emily in the chat asked, I think there was a lowercase u in the array of songs in holdup, and the function was called with holdup. I'm not sure what the second part of the. Were you fixing a typo?
Oh yeah. That's a typo.
Let's see.
Oh, and that's why it threw the error that I told it to throw.
I didn't notice when that one popped in, so we could have maybe saved you some time if we'd had the eagle-eyed debugger right there live.
It's almost as if the program did exactly what I told it to do.
Yeah, computers, man. Can't live with them, can't throw them out the window. What is a
So
good,
what I should have done is then put my PPP up here.
what is a good starter project to practice Python?
Oh, good question.
So that is a really good question. So as it happens, I'm going to put a link in the chat. I've been collecting things that might be useful projects, maybe not quite for beginners, but if you're sort of at an intermediate level and you're just looking for ideas, I called them kindling projects because it's sort of get your fire started.
Yeah. Also,
So
like if you're a web developer, I'm a web developer, so that's where I'm coming from. But if you're a web developer, like making a little Flask app is a good way to learn Python. I think I would, start from a working base, but then you can just write a little web app using Flask. It's pretty lightweight and easy to get started on.
I'll make a pitch for a site I'm putting also here in the chat called Advent of Code.
Oh yeah.
A coding challenge that runs every day in December. I think this is maybe their 5th or 6th year that they'll be running. Every day in December, you come to the site and they've got a new programming challenge for you. And they're all very humorous Santa themed things. You know, it's like your elf hid the toy list in the safe and you need to decode the combination or something like that. It's very engrossing and they can get—
It's language agnostic, correct?
It's completely language agnostic. So it could be an interesting way to work on a new language. So we've got more questions, but we're also, although we only have 2 of the 3 talks that we had planned, Lael did such a comprehensive job that we might actually be running a little short on time. So
sorry, I let it run over because I knew we had extra time.
no, and I was happy to have you use the time. Andrew, I'll cover the last question here. Is it safe to use a mutable value in a class as a init method for default value? The init method in the class, which is the constructor for the class, it gets called automatically when you make a new instance, is a function like any other. And so all the caution that you should use for default values of any other function applies to your dunder init as well. So you should not use a mutable value like a list as a default value in your dunder init method.
I'm trying to figure out how to
unshare.
How to unshare again. But
yeah.
Maybe if someone else shares, then I won't have to unshare.
So while Lael, who is genius enough to master 2 languages but can't figure out how to unshare in Zoom because Zoom is terrible, while they're figuring it out, I'll mention that we're going to be holding a raffle after the second talk. I wasn't sure we'd be able to do it, but we have the technology. We're going to be raffling off 3 licenses for the PyCharm IDE. And yes, the slides will be posted to the Meetup event page. We'll put links to the slides on the Meetup event pages.
PyCharm is great.
Thank you, Lael, very much, everyone. Katie, are you ready?
I am. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
And you see only my Google Slides and not my Slack messages.
We don't see Slack, but we do see all of the Google Slides UI. So you need to go into presentation. There you go.
Cool. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Kathleen Nahabedian, but everybody calls me Katie. And if you hear some background noise, sorry about that. My husband and I just adopted a new puppy and he went out with his friends and she's very upset about it. So I'm sorry if there's a lot of crying and banging in the background. So I'm a data engineer at Capital One. I've been here only about 8 months or so. And before that, I spent about 10 years as research staff at MIT Lincoln Lab up on the Air Force Base in Lexington. Educationally, my background is in math, but almost all of my work since graduation has been in data science and machine learning. So that's what I'm good at, but disclaimer, data visualization is not something that I'm particularly good at, and I'm definitely not the expert on this topic, but it's something that I've realized is really important. And so that's the reason why I, decided to put together a talks to force myself to improve my own skills, because in my last job at Lincoln Lab, we had graphic artists who would, whose job it was to clean up and make pretty our technical slides, and they, man, always had their work cut out with me. So it's my goal to be better. And I feel like I've learned a lot putting together this deck and the demo that you'll see. Minnie. I've definitely noticed as I progress in my career just how important it is to be able to tell good stories with data. And a lot of that I feel like has to do with the kinds of visualizations that you make, making things that are clear and concise, easy to read. So for example, with the right visualizations, you can tell a story about the relationships between two variables. Here you've got two variables that have a pretty linear relationship, and a plot can show you that. You can make comparisons between different variables, and you can look at the distributions or what's the word I'm trying to think of, composition of variables, and a lot more, like the evolution of variables over time, or things to do with navigation, stuff like that. But while visualizations can be really helpful for telling stories, they can just as easily mislead or confuse. And to demonstrate that, we're going to play a little game. So on each of these next 4 slides, I'm going to show you an example of a data visualization, and I'm going to give you 10-15 seconds, and I want you in that time to try and understand what the creator of this graphic was trying to say. What does this graphic actually mean? Okay, so if everybody is ready, the first slide, 15 seconds, go. All right, time. So I don't know about you, but I was thoroughly confused the first time I tried to read this graph. There's this outer ring that shows the years 2002 to 2011, but then on the inside, there's some weird pie chart going on with 2012 and 2013. There's little arrows here next to the Facebook logo and next to what I had to Google to find out was the MySpace logo. They don't actually tell you that on this slide. There's just, it's too much, it's too cluttered, there's too much going on. It's interesting information, but I would argue that this is not the most effective way to convey that information. Okay, slide number 2, ready, go. Okay, so I think what they're trying to show is a comparison between students' usage of substances compared to their perceived use. But I had to read this really dense text at the top to figure that out. And then you've got some bar charts, which make no sense. if you look at the scales of these numbers and you look at the heights of these bar charts, it doesn't matter if this red number is twice the white number or if it's 30 times the white number. All of these bar charts are exactly the same height. And I would say that this is pretty misleading at worst, or just like a mistake at best. All right, so next slide, we're gonna see something that may be a little bit misleading. Ready, go. Okay, so this is, some of you may recognize this. This is a fairly famous example of a misleading graphic. So you look at it and you're like, all right, through the 1990s to the early 2000s, looks like murders are increasing. And then 2005, Florida enacts the Stand Your Ground law. And oh, look, there's like a drastic decrease in murders. But what's wrong with this graphic? Take a look at the y-axis, it's upside down. And so I don't know if it was the intention of the creator of this graphic to make you think that it was the Stand Your Ground law that led to a sudden decrease in murders, when in fact, it may not be because of the Stand Your Ground law, but it's not the fact that murders dropped off right after the law was passed. And now the fourth slide, it's not really, I think it's just kind of funny. So I'm just gonna put this up here for a few seconds. Yesterday's results. What was the best part of the Super Bowl? 73% say yes, 27% say no. Maybe don't do this. Also, one thing that I've learned in my work is to be really careful with colors. When I write papers, I make graphs and I use colors a lot to distinguish between different variables. But in my last workplace, we didn't have a really big budget for a color printer. Everything got printed out in black and white, and my managers would go to read my papers and say, all of these variables look exactly the same. So just be aware that sometimes people aren't looking at a screen. They may actually be printing them out and like on a newspaper or from a black and white printer. Okay, so we're going to talk about actually creating visualizations in Python, and the landscape of visualization libraries in Python is pretty nuts. There's a whole lot going on here, and it can sometimes be difficult to decide what am I actually going to use to create my plots. So today we're just going to focus on 4 that I'm most familiar with, that I've seen the most used in my workplace. And that will be Matplotlib, Seaborn, Bokeh, and Altair. So if you've been using Python for a while, you're probably familiar with Matplotlib because I think it was the first really mature data visualization tool for Python. It was originally developed to be really desirable for scientists and engineers who are really used to doing things in MATLAB. And it is really powerful. You can create some really cool stuff with Matplotlib. But the syntax can be pretty verbose. Sorry, Minnie. Like it can take a lot of typing to get a figure to look the way that you want. And there's also not a whole lot of support for interactivity. Number 2 is Seaborn. So this is built on top of Matplotlib, and I really like it a lot. There's less typing involved to make something that looks really nice, because there's a lot of really nice default themes and color palettes. And there's a lot of support for really good statistical visualization, distributions and such. The third is bokeh. So this is really good for interactive visualizations. It's pretty easy to use. There are some limitations to export capabilities, like you can export HTML, or you can get JSON blocks that you can pass to a JavaScript library to render the image. And you can, I think, download PNGs, but there's no support for PDF or a couple other things. And then finally, Altair. This is actually my new favorite shiny toy that I hadn't heard of until I attended the PyData conference last week. But I saw a couple talks on it and I'm already kind of in love. So I rushed to cram the Altair stuff into this talk because I think it's really neat. It's a declarative visualization library as opposed to an imperative visualization library like Matplotlib. And what I mean by that is with Altair, you tell Altair what your final answer, like what your final image should look like, and it will take care of the details. Whereas with Matplotlib, you're going through the steps of typing out exactly how that image is going to be created. There's also a ton of support for creating interactive plots, dynamically selecting things on the page and filtering data based on different criteria. All right, so let's take a look at all of this stuff in action. So I have
gotten no questions, but lots of excitement about the puppy.
Excitement about what?
The puppy in chat.
Oh, I'll see if I can get her on screen later. So I have this Jupyter notebook, and at the end of the slides, I'll post a link to my GitHub so that you guys, if you want these examples for your own work, you'll have access to that. So we're going to go through a bunch of different types of plots and how you would use these 4 different libraries to create those. Starting with, well, I guess first starting with importing our libraries. This output notebook, the second cell is so that bokeh will display the images within my notebook rather than displaying it elsewhere. And I'm going to be using just a bunch of toy data sets. So for example, we are going to look at some penguins. We've got different species, we've got different islands that they live on, and then just physical attributes like their flippers and their bills and their body mass and sex. So to create a scatter plot in Matplotlib, it's actually really simple. If I go up to where I imported matplotlib.pyplot as PLT. I think that's what most people do. So PLT is what I'm going to use for Matplotlib to create a scatter plot. And on the x-coordinate, the x-axis, I'll give the flipper length. And on the y-axis, I'll put the body mass. And there you go. It just plots all of the dots on a graph for you. But it's a little bit plain. You'll notice there's no labels. So if you want to add a label for your axes or for the title, it's as simple as saying plt.xlabel, plt.ylabel, or plt.title. And there you go. It's pretty easy. Seaborn is pretty similar syntax, which makes sense because Seaborn was built on top of Matplotlib. It's nice that Seaborn actually labels your axes for you, but you do have to add your own title. So I do that with a dot set title at the end of my call. And there you go, a nice simple scatter plot. If we go to bokeh, the syntax is pretty simple. But what's nice here is that it's interactive. So I can take my mouse and click and drag and it will pan on the screen. I can click on this little zoom button and select an area that I want to observe closer, or I can zoom back out. I can save a PNG from this image. So it's cool. You can, you don't just plot it once and be done. You can actually look at the data more closely. And then here's just how you would add labels to your x-axis, your y-axis, and your title. All right, so now we're on to Altair, which is the most different from the others, I think. The syntax is definitely different. So here, I'm telling Altair, create me a chart, and the source of data that will be going to this chart is this penguins pandas data frame. And from there, I want you to be marking points. So you can, with Altair, choose mark point, mark bar, mark circle, mark square. It's just a matter of changing this function right here. And then I say, okay, I'm going to tell you what my the encodings are for the x-axis and the y-axis. These are the variables that I want to use, and that's it. And so this is what you would get from Altair. A little bit annoying that the data is not really centered, because by default, the axes start at 0, but we can fix that. We can also add a title. So I'm going to fix the axis limits, add a title. I'm going to change the figure size, fill in the circles, because I prefer, I don't know, just I like it better when the circles are filled in. And then I'm going to allow the user to pan and zoom by using this interactive function. So if I call this, then cool, it's a different size. My points are more centered on the screen. And then, like with bokeh, I can drag to pan, and then I'm using my mouse wheel to zoom in and out. All right, so that's scatter plots. Next up, bubble plots. So this is very similar to scatter plots. It's just that I'm going to be changing the size of the dots or the circles based on some other variable. So you can sort of see 3 variables at once. And I'm going to have my marker size for this graph, the size of those circles, be based on the bill length. So I'm just kind of like normalizing my variables so that small values closer to the minimum bill length will be really small, and values close to the maximum bill length will be big. And so with matplotlib, you're just taking your normal scatter plot, but we're basically doing what we did before, but we have this extra S that we're passing, which stands, I think, for size. And so I'm going to just have the size be my marker size. Actually, I multiplied this by 5. The different libraries have different ways of deciding how big those bubbles will be. So 5 seemed to look nice to me. Like you can see some very small circles down here, some large circles up here. So you can see sort of the relationship between 3 variables at once. Seaborn bubble plots, very similar. I'm using this size equals penguins marker size here by 10 times 10. It looks pretty similar. One thing that I did notice, this one creates an actual legend for you, so you can see how the size of the circles corresponds to the values that you're plotting. But remember that this is our marker size, which is this like normalized value that I created before. So you'd probably have to do a little bit of work to actually have this reflect the true millimeters of their bill length. Okay, another cool thing, you can add color coding of your bubbles. So let's say I wanted to color code the penguins by species. I just pass this extra hue equals penguins species, and your legend automatically updates to say, all right, I mean, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce these words, but here are your 3 different species. And you can sort of see the relationship between species and flipper length, species and body mass, species and your marker size. So it's a neat way to see multiple variable interactions at the same time. Bokeh bubble plots, pretty similar. I'm not going to go through, just for the sake of time, all of the syntax. That will change because I'll give you guys a link to this notebook afterwards. But it's pretty similar from library to library. But you can also color code these in the same way that we did with Seaborn. A little bit annoying that Bokeh doesn't create a legend automatically for you. And from what I saw on Stack Overflow, it's actually a little bit of a pain to create one with bubble plots. So that's one downside. Seaborn does it for you, Altair will do it for you, but Bokeh will not. And then finally, Altair bubble plots. Yeah, so here I'm just saying that the size of the bubble plots will be the marker size. This is like the same plot that we saw before, but it creates the legend for you. And I'm gonna quickly text my husband to ask him to keep it down while we talk. Can you guys hear him in the background? A little bit? Okay. Actually, Kelsey, if you're on this call, can you text him? Or Ash?
Kelsey gave you a thumbs up.
Thanks. Thank you. One neat thing about Altair is that you can add tooltips so that you can mouse over these bubbles. So I did this by adding this tooltip. So I said a list of all of the variables that I want to see when I mouse over one of the bubbles. And I also color coded at the same time. So now when I mouse over any of these points, you can see the flipper length, the body mass, the bill length, the species. And it's just kind of neat. You can do a lot of neat data exploration at the same time. This is a little bit more advanced stuff, but it's something that I think is a really nice feature of Altair, is that you can have linked brushing between multiple plots. So here I'm creating two, in this case, just scatter plots. And I've got slightly different axes. So the y-axis on both of these is the body mass, but the flipper length is over here, the bill length is over here. And I can select points over here, and it will show me the corresponding points on the plot on the right.
Whoa.
Yeah. So I can either choose to display just these points over here, or in this next example, I can say just like leave everything on the right side, but just only color in the ones that are part of my selection. I think this is one of my favorite features of Altair. And there's a lot of good documentation about other types of interactions that you can do. In the name of time, I'm probably going to skip over some of these other simple like line graphs and just kind of point out the more cool stuff. So here, Bokeh, you have the ability to not only create a line graph, but have two different lines and then color in between them, which is a nice feature if you're trying to see like the difference between, in this case, it's these stock prices, like the high and the low for the day. So it's a nice way to see something like this, like some time series data. Bar charts are pretty easy. Again, I'll post the link to this so you guys can, well, I guess I'll just flip through. So this is the Titanic data set, how many people were in each class with Seaborn. And then you can also break it down by sex. So you can have comparisons of variables within the bar chart. Here's Bokeh. This isn't too exciting. Altair, they're just doing the same thing with slightly different syntax. Histograms. So I'm creating I'm showing the distribution of age of people on the Titanic. Same thing with Seaborn. Looks pretty similar. Bokeh apparently recently removed histograms in their recent versions, and now it's apparently really difficult. I mean, it's not super difficult, but it's a lot of work to create a histogram in Bokeh. I don't know why they did that, but it is how it is. Altair looks kind of nice. Box plots. So another way to see the distribution of the age of people on the Titanic. With Seaborn, with Altair, they look a little bit different. One's horizontal, one's vertical. Just kind of a neat thing to know that you can do. Heat maps. This is something that I use a lot, and I must have, sorry about that. Let's do flights equals load data set. There we go. So here's a heat map of the number of flights that took place during each month between the years 1949 and 1960. So it's kind of a neat way to see patterns or hot spots. Yeah, I use these a lot. Bokeh also apparently removed the ability to do heat maps in recent versions. It used to be there, but now it's not. Altair can also do heat maps. So this is the same data set, just with a slightly different color map. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you, I think this is really cool, maps with Altair. So I'm gonna read in some data that has to do with COVID deaths in each state. So this is some data that I just found on the internet. And one thing with Altair is that you can't use data sets, or it warns you, stops you if you try to use a data set with more than 5,000 rows. The way to get around that is to do this data transformers.enable JSON. So it will, each time you create a plot, it will temporarily write a small file to disk and then reread it. But it's not that big a deal. So here I'm loading in some states data, and I can plot my map. Looks kind of nice. And then I'm going to, I won't go through all the syntax, but I'm gonna create a slider that will let me scrub back and forth in time. And then I'm going to plot deaths as a circle on the map. So the bigger the circle, the more deaths that happened during that, that month. And so you can plot the circles on top of that gray map. I haven't yet figured out how to get this to display the actual time rather than just the timestamp, but you can see that at the beginning there was a lot of stuff going on in New York, and then as time went by, started to spread, and now it's just kind of everywhere. There's also a change in the scale of the legends that maybe makes it look a little bit less dramatic, but it's kind of cool that you have this ability to just dynamically filter data within your plot. So that's what I got. I'll put the slides up on the meetup page, and here's the GitHub or my GitHub where you can see all of the examples that I've posted. And feel free to email me with any questions. If you're trying to make a visualization and you can't quite get it right, I spent a lot of time trying to get this Jupyter notebook working. So I feel like I've gotten fairly good at debugging stuff like this. Yeah, thanks for your time. Let me know if there's any questions.
And I love the fact that you've got sort of the comparative anatomy of the 4 different libraries case by case, so that it's almost like a Rosetta Stone for the visualizations. It's very nice.
Yeah, thanks.
There was one question here in chat. In Altair, can you show the options available for the 3 dots?
For the 3 dots.
I don't know which dots. But.
Maybe like whoever asked that, like shoot me an email and I'll get back to you, promise.
Are there any other questions or accolades for Katie? Many people in the chat, I don't know if you probably weren't watching the chat, people were very pleased with what you've got to show. Someone asked, can you zoom the map? That one went to me privately. I don't think it was meant to, but can you zoom the map?
Oh, I didn't, but I wonder if let's see, if I make this interactive? Nope.
Someone says very excited about the mapping in Altair. I also am. I've been joking for a long while that pretty soon everything will be data science and I won't be able to attend my own meetup anymore because I don't really know anything about it. But the mapping, you may have heard me mention that I'm walking a lot these days. Now I've got something to actually do with it. So I may be digging into that myself.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katie, very much. So as I mentioned, so let's just have another round of silent applause for our 2 speakers. I really appreciate them doing this. I had reached out to people soliciting talks, and people are not always eager. They're not always excited to see me coming with that request. But Katie and Lael did a great job, and I really appreciate it. I think, personally, my opinion is that anyone here could give a talk, even if it's only 10 minutes long.